Hi, everybody. Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art. You'll be used to my ugly mug if you're a regular on the channel. I'm Paul Taylor, and here is my good friend Joshua. How do you pronounce your surname, Joshua?
Depends on where you're from, but J-Raj.
J-Raj. I didn't
Yeah.
want to be accused of racism from the get-go, so I'm glad I avoided that.
Well, that's a change.
Right. Do you want me to introduce you, or do you want to introduce yourself? I
No,
think...
go
Well, I'll
ahead.
introduce you, but I don't think you'll like it. But if you introduce yourself first, you'll have to correct that anyway, so...
Okay, you're telling me to introduce myself first.
Yeah, go on.
Hello, everybody. My name's Joshua. I am currently studying for an MDiv, which is a Master's in Divinity at Emory University in the Deep South, the southern state of Georgia. Georgia, Atlanta. I have a degree from the University of Leeds, which is where I met Paul Taylor, Dr. Paul A. Taylor, who was my dissertation supervisor. And prior to that, I worked in the film industry with Martin Scorsese and Thelma Schoonmaker, following my undergraduate degree in film. And I am a self-professing cultural Christian.
And what's your expertise? So could you just expand on your expertise in religion or Christianity in particular?
Yeah, so as I've said, I'm a what I would call a cultural Christian, in the sense that I believe in Christ, and I try to live out those tenets as best as I can. My interest in theology was that I wanted to make movies with a theological angle, much like Scorsese's early films. And so the way I went about doing that was to get a theological education first from Candler School of Theology. And my work sort of looks at kenosis and film as it purveys ideology, and theology as it unmasks it.
Could you explain kenosis for people?
Yeah, kenosis is essentially a self-emptying. So Christ on the cross, essentially God empties himself in the person of Christ, because he dies, he loses his divinity in a sense. So kenosis just means an emptying of the self, and in the Christ narrative, that is the emptying of God's divinity in the person of Christ at the crucifixion.
Right. So I'm just now playing around with the technology and messing things up as usual, which regulars will appreciate I do very well. Just for full disclosure, I'm a devout agnostic. So the idea of this particular section of the channel, again, I can't even say it, an agnostic guide to the Bible. The idea was for me as an agnostic to try and proselytize why the Bible is important for non-believers. And you're not really evangelical, are you, Joshua?
No, although I've spent time in the evangelical tradition.
Could I just show you, because I came prepared?
Yeah.
I've got my Bible if you make things up.
Okay.
But I thought if things went well, I also have we could do some snake handling later on.
Will there be any proclamations of Jesus in a southern accent?
I've tried doing an American accent before, and people made fun of me, and I think it's traumatized me.
I don't think that should stop you. It's not stopped you in the past.
Well, I can say yep and y'all.
There we go.
What else is there?
Not much else, frankly.
Right. Well, the idea about why I think the Bible is important as an agnostic, and will you keep me on track if I dive into this and you think I've gone too far off topic? Because I think what I'm about to say relates directly to literature. So the whole theme of this channel is about the importance of literature. I believe that we live in a post-literate age. And I think that's hugely significant in ways that most people don't realize. And given that the Bible, both in Old Testament and New Testament form, is one of the most powerful books in Western culture, and I think we talked off camera briefly, but you've mentioned it's a library within itself because there are multiple authors within it. But generally, it is a huge textual resource for imagery. But I'd argue, more importantly for me, psychology and philosophy, which I think gets massively underplayed. So to dive straight in, there's a guy called Alex O'Connor that I think most people might be familiar with who follow religion in any shape or form on YouTube, who, like me, is an agnostic, But what's interesting, I think, about agnostics is it can be quite a broad church, so to speak. I'm an agnostic, again, full disclosure, I'm an agnostic who has all the intellectual equipment to believe. And ironically, you need to psychoanalyze me now, Joshua, but I actually, intellectually, I think I am a believer in the sense that I was about to explain. It all makes sense to me. The biblical approach, the religious approach to life makes perfect sense. So unlike Alex O'Connor, I'm not someone who keeps asking for answers or asks religion to provide answers. What I happen to lack is just that little bit of spirit, or whatever you want to call it, that enables you to believe. It's like an engine missing petrol. I just don't think I have it. And I'm pretty sure as I approach my deathbed, it will suddenly appear. That's something that I am quite sure about.
It's funny how that happens.
Yeah. Well, who's the guy who said that there are no atheists in foxholes?
I don't know who said that.
I've forgotten, because this is the disadvantage of doing an interview with a senile person.
I will say on your little, sorry, did I interrupt you?
No, go
on. About the having the information but not the faith, reminds me of what a parable is. So obviously we know that Jesus spoke in parables and taught in parables, and there's a literary component there because, you know, parable is a story that allegorizes a lesson, and a parable in some sense compares a situation to another situation so as to comment on the situation that it's speaking of in allegorical form or symbolic form, however you want to think about it. But there's this other dimension of the parable, which is that an individual who is sympathetic to the parable that they're listening to is let into the parable so that they can understand it. Whereas, and there's a scripture for this which eludes me at the moment, but if I remember it, I'll come back to it. Whereas an individual who has shut themselves off from understanding it is not going to understand it. So it's almost as if curiosity is the key that opens the lock of parables. And I see religion that way. I see it as a sort of big meta parable. So if you have the curiosity to pursue it and be transformed by it, you will be let in. And if you don't, you will be hardened so as to not, you know, want to pursue or not be let in, as it were.
Well, could I pursue that further? Because this idea of curiosity, I do think it's crucial. But what intrigues me is, back to this Alex O'Connor thing. I pick on Alex O'Connor, not because I dislike him, not that he cares what I think. I actually think he's one of the more interesting professional atheists or agnostics. He presents himself in an incredibly reasonable fashion. He argues logically. I've seen him not rise to the bait and get angry particularly. So I appreciate that there's a civility to his discourse that I really appreciate. But he was on a program, I don't know how long ago it was, but I was seeing it recently. Is it a Diary of a CEO? Stephen Bartlett. And I don't have a go at him, but I just don't understand why he's so successful. He's like a digestive biscuit. It's just very, very plain. But on that program, there's 4 of them in total. There's Stephen Bartlett doing his digestive impression. There's a scientist and there's a religious guy, and then there's Alex O'Connor. And Alex O'Connor, interestingly for me, starts to get slightly emotional when he asks, as they're discussing religion, he says, how do you explain to a parent of a child with cancer? And he keeps pushing this issue about children with cancer. How could a just and right God allow that? So correct me if I'm wrong, it's the theodicy debate, isn't it? How does evil exist in a world with God? Now, why all this for me relates directly to the notion of the Bible and literature is that literature doesn't give you any answers. Good literature raises as many questions as it gives you answers. And the way I read, just let's start at the very beginning, the book of Genesis, this idea that we've been exiled from the Garden of Eden, and then the Israelites, the Exodus, being exiled almost semi-permanently. This idea of being exiled and that being part of the human condition, and original sin, which I think people massively misinterpret. To me, it's a metaphor for the idea we are fallible, fallen creatures. Human beings, by definition, are imperfect. And also, pain, I would suggest, is an essential aspect of human life, because otherwise you're just smoking an eternal spliff. That's not life. That is just being, going through some type of narcosis.
Yeah.
So my answer would be to Alex O'Connor, what I believe religion's usefulness is for me is that it provides a text that has trained me to realize that there aren't really any pat answers. So when Alex O'Connor wants the answer, I don't think you'll get it from the Bible. The Bible teaches you there are no answers. Life is tough. Suck it up and let's find ways to deal with it. But on a theological note, I've never understood the following, and I need you to help me think it through. One of Alex O'Connor's arguments, along with these other either atheists or agnostics, is this struggle to believe that evil or pain for children could exist in a world that God had designed. And it immediately just strikes me as, again, drawing on Genesis, the notion of free will. If human beings are to have free will, and if God isn't to interfere like a puppeteer every 5 minutes, A, human beings have to be capable of terrible evil to each other, and B, you're living in a world of scientific cause and effect, and earthquakes happen, floods happen, terrible things happen, because it's almost like the natural version of free will. And to expect human answers as to why children get cancer from a God that isn't human by definition strikes me that Alex O'Connor should be bright enough to realize he's insisting on human answers to non-human questions. So he's emotionally invested, which I found interesting. He's emotionally invested in being pissed off at a God that he doesn't think exists.
Yeah, I would say I completely agree with you on the point of, the Bible doesn't necessarily point to any answers, unless you were to ask a liberation theologian about, what they thought of that, because they would probably say that there is an answer. But I follow what you're saying, which is that there are no answers, suck it up, life is tough. And you see that at the very beginning, to use Augustinian language, original sin, when Adam and Eve are cast out of the garden. And how I would think of that is the birth of consciousness, because you have to have free will in order to choose to act with a sense of moral direction. Otherwise, you'd just be a robot. And it reminds me of Kierkegaard, who talks about anxiety as opposed to fear, where fear has an object, whereas anxiety is objectless. And so that sense of alienation after the original act of sin characterizes the world that we are in at the moment. And that anxiety comes from within, it's inescapable. And that there may not be an object, as there might have been had we still been in the garden, which again is a symbolic story, allegorical story.
Sorry to interrupt you, but I want to focus on that notion of the symbolism and the allegory.
Yeah.
Because again, Alex O'Connor made this snide comment. Well, for him, it was snide. I'm not saying it was a terrible comment, but he basically said, so children have to die of cancer just because some woman ate an apple. And there was quite a sneery tone. And it reminded me of the Richard Dawkins type phenomenon, where there seems to be a pathological incapability of understanding what a symbol and a metaphor are. And I do understand there are biblical fundamentalists who believe it is the word of God and it is literally true.
Yeah.
But my understanding also is that within Christianity, that's a relatively small minority. And the vast majority of Christians would say it's metaphorical. There is deep meaning within it, but it is communicated in the form of symbols, parables, as you mentioned, and allegory. And that brings me to why I wanted to do this with you, is because the more I explored on this channel the concept of literature and why it's important, there is this concept of in cognitive linguistics, I'm increasingly reading about the power, the formative power of metaphor. And there are various scientists who are arguing at the core of the human brain and its development, the human brain co-evolved with language, and metaphorical ways of thinking is an essential component of human thinking at its very root. And this is backed up in more popular scientific culture with Ian McGilchrist, who talks about left hemisphere, right hemisphere. The right hemisphere of the brain is devoted to metaphor and interpretation of things like allegory. The left-hand side of the brain is much more scientific and calculating. And his point is these two things are supposed to be working together. The Richard Dawkins of this world are privileging the left-hand side of the brain, the calculation, the need for systematic answers, and these things have dovetailed together. The more I looked at the actual Bible as a piece of literature, and I understand why that might offend some people, but we had a very brief discussion off camera that I honestly think one of the biggest shames. Sorry, I spilled my water. One of the biggest shames in a lot of people's experience of learning or reading the Bible is that it's not actually taught as English literature or any literature. It's taught as religious studies. Now, I can understand why if you taught it within English, religious Christian people might say, well, you're downgrading its status. But I think that many more people would be brought to the Bible if they understood how richly complex it is as a text. Would you think that's fair or not?
I think that's absolutely fair, particularly because the Bible is, as we've mentioned already, not a book, but a library of different texts of different genres that have been written by different people over the space of 1,000+ years, beginning in, roughly 1200 BCE. So this idea that that talking about the Bible in mundane terms, might bring down its divinity or its status as a divine text, I think is kind of missing the forest for the trees, because they are texts written by people who lived in a particular world. So I think, yeah, I'd agree with that greatly. One of the things is, in the creation story of Genesis, there are different authors, different voices. This is one of the theories anyway. It's not, scholars still to this day argue about the documentary hypothesis, which basically says that there are different voices in the creation narrative, and in the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Bible. And there are different authors, and we've determined this by how they use language and how they refer to God. So, for instance, the J author is one of the authors that's identified because whoever has written it refers to God as Yahweh. And so the German theologian that found this out, in German, Yahweh begins with a J. So it became known as the J author. Then there's the E author, who refers to the author that refers to God as Elohim. So right there in, the first few pages are 2 different distinct voices. And these things are worth looking into, and not just taken, literally, because there is a world behind the text.
I think Harold Bloom, who's an interesting character, you could do a whole video on him and more. But I think so. He read fluent Hebrew. I can't remember whether it was Hebrew or Yiddish, but his first language, I think, was probably Yiddish. And he actually didn't learn English till relatively late, till about 5 or 6, I think I remember reading, which is quite interesting because before he died, he was one of the world's most preeminent literary critics. And except he'd pronounce certain words in English incorrectly as a legacy of learning English relatively late. But I think he argued that, he theorized that the J author might have actually been a woman at the court of King David.
Yeah, I don't speculate about that, because there are some things that we just don't know, and theological scholars will tell you there are things we just don't know. Even that theory is just a theory. We don't know, but there's a strong case for that to be the case. There's the J author, the E author, the D author, who writes deuteronomically, and the P author, which is the priestly author. So they all have different inflections in the way they write about God and creation. As a matter of fact, Genesis has two creation narratives.
Yeah.
Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 have different depictions of creation. In Genesis 1, supposedly written by the E author, who refers to God as Elohim, God is presented as sort of this transcendent force, impersonal force, who's sort of out there. And then in Genesis 2, that same story about the creation of man is given a lot more intimacy, and God is anthropomorphized in a sense, and is sort of walking amongst Adam and Eve, and is referred to as Yahweh and not Elohim. And even those two words to describe God they mean different things. So the language will tell you that this isn't just one story, and this isn't just one sense of truth. There seems to be a plurality here of truth in the theological sense, and we as readers need to hold that in tension, hold those truths in tension. And perhaps that's what I'm hearing when you talk about Dawkins and Alex O'Connor, because there are different kinds of truth. There's the truth that says this is a mug, but then there's also the truth that says that love is a good virtue, or
I think Heidegger distinguished between the true and the correct. So it's correct to say there is a mug. It's true to say whether you love someone or don't love them.
Sure.
So for at least Heidegger, who wasn't particularly religious, I don't think, and I had a very murky past, but I find it interesting. It's about this concept of disclosure. So in Heidegger's philosophy, there's a notion of unconcealment. And I think he got his equivalent of theological from the German poet Hölderlin, who he treated almost as a, divine poet. But this concept of unconcealment, we learn about reality as it reveals itself to us.
Yeah.
And he's writing as a phenomenologist. Basically, you could debate what Heidegger qualified as a philosopher. But it's interesting from a completely purely philosophical point of view. You end up using some quite biblical conceptions of being thrown into the world as a naked human being. Even Sartre, I would suggest the arch atheist, this idea of being alone in the world in an existential battle. It's all there in the Bible.
Yeah.
Put in a different way. And to repeat what I was going to say earlier, this idea that I don't think people see it as interesting, because even the brief explanation you've given of the different voices in Genesis opens up a whole new realm of interpretation. But I just think the Bible is taught, at least in my school experience, is taught so badly and so dully that it just seems to be a real shame that this type of resource for exploring different perspectives is often lost.
Yeah, I agree with that. And also there's, we've just spoken about the Old Testament. There's plenty of examples throughout the Old Testament and going into the New Testament as well about this sort of plurality of what the Bible seeks to convey. And each different book is even, geared at different objectives. So I would just add that as well.
And it's interesting, the notion of because to switch tack, but just to show how relevant all this stuff is to literature, Mikhail Bakhtin, the Russian theorist of linguistics and literature, he introduced their very famous notions in literature, but the polyphonic and the dialogism, I can't even say it again, but the idea that there are multiple voices, and he applied it in particular to Dostoevsky's work, which I'll be looking at shortly. But this idea that there are multiple voices in Dostoevsky, and that's why his books are quite frenetic, they're quite complex, they're layered, various characters represent various different viewpoints. And I'm just thinking, in the days we live today, in these polarized, ideologically, mono culture, that people live in their own little tribe, people struggle to understand anyone else's perspective. And even when they're intellectually curious, to take it back to what we were discussing earlier, their curiosity is one-dimensional in the sense It's not polyphonic. It's not multiple voices. They want a scientific answer, or the media is often premised upon getting to the root of things, showing images of things as if that's the answer. So I remember growing up, without going into the politics of it, God forbid, but the Israel-Palestine conflict.
Yeah.
And ever since I was a kid, the news would have archetypal images of stone-throwing Palestinians and Israeli tanks. And every time they had a story, these images would come up. Now, on the one hand, you think you're seeing something of the truth about the Middle East. In actual intellectual terms, you learn nothing. You don't learn about the history of the region. You don't learn about the causes of whatever conflict it was at the time. And it's this shorthand that the media is based upon. And it's very deceiving because these images seem to be full of meaning when actually the more you see, the less you understand.
Yeah. I was going to say that I think, people like making sense of things and making meaning. One of the ways they do that is through images and storytelling and narratives. And Slavoj Žižek obviously talks about ideology being, or not Slavoj Žižek, a professor at New York University. His name is Dana Polan. He talks about images and cinema particularly, but also images being the site of ideological creation. So you look at something and already you've constructed something in your subconscious mind about what you're seeing, even though it's not saying that thing. And I think media companies use that to their advantage.
I was going to think of, I was going to start you off because I just wanted to give a very specific example because the dangers we just witter on in generalities, but
Yeah.
with regards to some of the subtleties of the Bible.
Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but just one little example of something I found fascinating was the I can't remember which gospel it was in, but when Jesus says, "If you're struck, turn the right cheek."
Yeah.
I remember reading that this basically, it's always been interpreted or misinterpreted as the idea that turn away from violence, show the other cheek, be a pacifist. When in fact, according to rabbinical law, if you presented your right cheek, you explain if I've got it wrong, but I think if you're hit on the left cheek, it means you've been hit with the back of the hand. And that's quite a violent thing that you do to someone who is beneath your social standing.
Yeah.
If you present your right cheek, you're expecting to be slapped as someone would an equal.
Right.
And
right.
paradoxically, that is a more threatening response because you're saying, I reject your initial violence. I demand that you treat me as an equal. And
yes.
You're complicating the situation. Is that right?
Yes. And there's also, people tend to forget that Jesus was a Jew, and he's speaking to, a Hellenistic world that's full of Jews and people that believe in the Greek gods. And so a lot of what Jesus will say is Jewish, and a lot of the significance of even the Passion narrative echoes sort of Jewish truths of the time and the culture. The other thing is that particular story is also hinting at is forgiveness, which is obviously one of the big Christian tenets, where it says, should you give 7 times or 70 times? No, you should forgive 770 times. So that's one of the Christian readings of that story.
But would you agree that it's potentially problematic in the sense that's an overly lenient reading of what Jesus was actually saying from a Jewish perspective?
Yeah, this is one of the problems of hermeneutics, is that you've got the Jewish reading, which people will reject. A lot of Christians will reject. Then you got the Christian reading, the Christian readings that a lot of not just Jewish people, but people who are opposed to Christianity will reject as well. It's one of those things that we don't know for certain, but you can apply that reading to it, if that makes sense. It's hard to know. It's hard to say for certain. That's one of the big things I've taken away from Candler.
Well, yeah, and the other thing, again, just to go back to my point about the media is based upon a lack of nuance most often. It's trying to make the most explicit points possible,
Yeah.
with the extreme example of, basically borderline pornography on TV or cinema all the time. There's nothing, and there's a beautiful phrase from Theodore Adorno where he talks about the culture industry is, what did you say? Real art is aesthetic, ascetic,
Yeah.
and unashamed. The culture industry is pornographic and prudish. So for people who haven't followed that, what he's saying is the good art is actually, it uses minimalist techniques. So it's not expansive. It's like a hermit. It's got limited. A painter, for example, just uses a canvas and oils.
Yep.
So it hasn't got Hollywood type resources. So it's ascetic, it's limited, it restrains itself, but it's unashamed. It deals with the huge, big issues of life, love, treachery, everything in the Bible. Whereas the culture industry, modern media, they pretend to deal with everything. But for example, I think it's a point Zizek might have made back in the day where he said, you see all these Hollywood films where people struggle, then they get married, but they don't show the after effects of the marriage. The films, or Hollywood films, always end with a happy marriage. But what about 15 years later when the woman's picking up the man's dirty underwear for the 15th time that day?
Yeah,
And
exactly.
I'm careful what I say here, but the terminal boredom and the resentment that builds up, arguably, that's what a good novel would explore.
Yeah.
A good novel tends not to end on the happy marriage. The novel, like Anna Karenina, just reminded me that, the first line of Anna Karenina, each unhappy family is unhappy in their own particular way. That's what good literature and art explores.
Yeah.
It's not pornographic, but it actually deals with real issues, whereas the pornography of the mainstream media hides the fact it never really addresses anything of substance.
Yeah, when you were talking about Zizek and the kind of sublimation of suffering, as it were, or maybe you weren't saying that, and maybe I'm reading into that, reading sublimation into what you're saying. But I was watching Saving Private Ryan. This is an aside, so forgive me. Saving Private Ryan, the opening scene says June 6th, 1944, and the next 10 minutes depict the Into the Jaws of Death scene, World War II. And, there's these slow motion shots and bodies flying everywhere and people dying and, dismembered bodies and all this sort of thing. And I was thinking that, already the audience knows the end, the outcome. So in a sense, what's dying isn't the narrative, and what's dying aren't the platoons of soldiers that are on the front lines on the screen facing the abyss, but actually the abyss itself dies, because it's those first 10 minutes echo into the next hour and 50 minutes or whatever it is that's left of the film, and sort of neatens this struggle of these soldiers into a sort of heroic imperative in the audience. And I think films do that. They take something that's, abysmal, disgusting, horrible, unthinkable. And in a sense, there's a sleight of hand that happens that turns it into something perhaps a subconscious way, perhaps not, that neatens it into some kind of ideological truth when there isn't one.
Well, it's almost like, because in Freud, there's this concept of displacement and condensation. It's what our dreams do. But the point about dreams is they're really complex. And yes, you can learn to decode them and you can work out what your conscious is suppressing, what your id is suppressing, what your superego might be overthinking. And these things can come out, but they're contained in these dense or condensed metonymic images that you dream and don't seem to make sense. And if you're worried about something, that gets displaced into a dream that you've left the cooker on. These type of shifts go on. But again, a dream like literature tends to be ambiguous and open to interpretation. Everything you're describing about the way film grammar works, apart from, I'd excuse someone like Hitchcock, generally within the culture industry, it's pre-packaged, the cultural equivalent of ultra-processed food. Would you agree with that?
Completely agree with that. An example comes to mind that actually Zizek, to not to bring him up a third time, but he said, and this is to do with not with films, but just how ideology functions in modern society. And he gives the example of Starbucks. Have you heard this? The Starbucks example.
I think I have, because I think I wrote about it in my book, but I used the KFC counter example. But go on, give me the Starbucks.
Yeah, he goes, obviously Starbucks is this, global company, TNC, and you know what you're getting. You're getting a product that reliably is a cappuccino, and you know exactly, it's predictable what you're getting, and it's convenient, right? And on a Starbucks cup is usually a little sticker that indicates that the beans were sourced sustainably and ethically and all these different things to indicate that that they're doing their bit. But what they do is they charge you a premium. So what would ordinarily be like, $3 or $4 becomes $6, $7, but you're happy paying it because the moral virtue is included in the price. So they sell you that very feeling of inadequacy. They commodify that feeling of inadequacy and sell it back to you in that way, and the cycle continues. So I think that's, in a sense, that's how ideology functions. But certainly that's how it functions in film too, where you watch a film like Saving Private Ryan, and you've participated in this economy of suffering, but for a good cause. And so it gives you some sense of meaning and some sense of identity, which actually touches on why the Bible began in the first place. And a professor I know, his name's Jacob Wright, he wrote a book called Why the Bible Began, and I'd recommend reading it. It's a fantastic book. Actually talks about the origins of the Hebrew Bible, and those origins are rooted in exile of the Jewish people. And so they're writing this narrative about themselves to give themselves some kind of meaning and identity. And it's a tale as old as time, this sense of meaning and telling stories to reaffirm who we are. And I think the film industry does that very, very well.
Yeah, to go back to reinforce what you're saying about the Starbucks example, because I wrote a book about Zizek, and my example I used along those lines was I've gone through various food phases in my life.
Yeah.
I went through, I'm ashamed to admit it now, I went through a KFC phase. I lived in an area of Manchester where there was a KFC nearby. And partly, to be honest, in my own defense, part of my reason for getting too much KFC was you could have done a documentary in that KFC. It was the single most dysfunctional fast food outlet I've ever seen in my life. And I think it only lasted about 2 years because there were basically, you could see staff stealing in front of you.
Oh.
And it was like a Monty Python sketch in a KFC. It was truly bizarre. But anyway, yeah. I remember once getting, it was a massive bucket of food. And there was a symbol at the bottom saying something along the lines of a certain percentage of this bucket's price will go to feeding the starving in Africa.
Yeah.
So I actually sat there in my underpants like Homer Simpson, stuffing my face with a KFC, was helping world hunger.
Yeah.
And that's the logic of that ideology.
Yeah, there's the absurdity of, spending 10 or 15 pounds at this institution that is, buying chickens by, the millions of kilograms, the tons, and that somehow is contributing to the feeding of starving children in Africa.
But to get it back to and to get it back to the Bible, what the Bible does is the exact opposite. Whereas the example you gave from Starbucks and the example I've given from KFC, I think it's called a legerdemain, the sleight of hand that a conjurer uses. The ideological sleight of hand is to make you feel good about something that actually is sinful, gluttony.
Yeah.
But you're led to believe that's actually the very problem is the solution.
Yes, exactly.
Whereas the Bible most often reverses that, and things that you thought were unproblematic become problematic.
Yeah.
in quite beautiful, subtle ways, I'd suggest.
Yeah. What do you mean by that last point you just made?
Well, the Bible takes, I'm thinking of parables. So in the New Testament, I gave you the example of the turn the other cheek can actually mean the opposite of what it's been taken to mean. So it interests me. I have very little truck for Derrida. I find him incredibly obtuse and difficult. But it's interesting that a postmodern theorist like Derrida, who talks about the endless interpretive nature of any text, that's what the Bible enshrines. The Bible can be interpreted in so many different ways. And I can see why for some people that's immensely frustrating. And also the Alex O'Connors of this world who keep us, give me the answer, give me the answer. Well, what if the answer is there are no answers? And more than that, not only are there no answers, any answers that life can give you are likely to cause more questions and more confusion. And guess what? That's what it is to be a human being.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the example I think of is that when you look, I'm obsessed by Proust, and I'm going to do in the new year, if anyone's interested or didn't know, I'm going to do a reading group that goes through Proust approximately 200 pages at a time and does the whole thing. And I'm sure by the end of it, it's going to be me talking to myself with a Proust book open, but I don't care. People need to suffer. But the point why, one of the major reasons I'm obsessed with Proust is that in that book, all 4,000 odd pages, depending on the edition, it's about how there are no answers. He's looking back on his life. And you can't even, the point he makes about involuntary memory, you can't even control your own memories. So if I said to you, what's the truth of your life? It's almost a meaningless question in terms of what's happened in your life, because a lot of it will be random, a lot of it will be misremembered. You have to tell stories to yourself to make sense of what's happened. Your brain deliberately forgets things. You have fond memories. Like, you've stayed at my house once and I have fond memories. The reality was it was horrible. But you repress this down, don't you?
Right.
And you might come and visit me again. I think it's like giving birth. You forget the pain and you do it again.
Yeah.
But that's what Proust did. And it's what I think is so ironically realistic about fiction. Without degrading the Bible, if you think of the Bible as a highly sophisticated piece of literary art,
Yeah.
and if you think of someone like Proust, what they're doing is actually, it's the most realistic way of explaining what it is to be human that you could not explain by having a medical dictionary in front of you.
Right.
It's
Right.
what fiction and what the Bible does better than any scientific paper is actually express, and not just express, it explores what it is to be human.
Right. Right. And the Christian response to this would be, or maybe not the Christian response, but my reading into Christianity would be that, we all know that Christ comes down in the New Testament to atone for our sins. I think we all know that. But and then when Christ dies and resurrects, we are given what is called as the Holy Spirit, which is part of the Trinity. And so Christ dies, ascends into heaven, we're given the Holy Spirit, and that is now the new communion, the church. Well, what I find compelling in a post-structuralist reading of the crucifixion is that idea of kenosis that we've talked about, the self-emptying of God. So on the cross, in the person of Christ, God dies. And so there's this interesting and subversive idea that probably isn't held by many Christians, that in a sense, God abdicates on the cross because Jesus Christ cries out, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me? So God forsakes God and in a sense absconds and abdicates the throne. And so what's left is a collective church, a fellowship of believers. And to me, I read that as being a really subversive and radical message of there is no big other anymore. There is no guarantor. You are on your own. as
Yeah, and
subversive as that may be.
no, but that goes to what I was saying before about Alex O'Connor. He seems to want to, whether it's there's daddy. I think it's interesting. I think religious people are often accused of having daddy issues with God, but I think a lot of atheists or agnostics have daddy issues with science.
Yeah.
At least with God as a daddy figure. Is it Blake called him Noba Daddy or Urizen? But the idea is that this bearded, white-haired person on a cloud. I quite like that portrayal of God. I've no idea why. But that
is
is
he retired as well?
Yeah, he's retired, and apparently God lives in North Wales. You've distracted me now. Where was I going with this? They want science has become the big daddy, the big other. Science is what they think will give them the answers. And I'm sorry to keep circling around this, but it strikes me that if the reality is there are no answers and you're on your own, as you've just described one interpretation, that would be a perfect summary of the lack of overt meaning in the Bible and the constant tension in both Old Testament and New Testament between latent, to use psychoanalytical terms, latent and manifest meaning.
Yeah.
The manifest meaning, even in the parables that seem to make the clearest, simplest parables, even they arguably are full of latent meaning. So off the top of my head, I can think of the parable of the Good Samaritan.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone's familiar with the thing. Someone gets beaten up. The person who saves them on the road to Jericho is a Samaritan who at the time would have been the last person you'd expect to help you. And that's always been interpreted as the importance of doing good acts for others. But then there's another, you can explain this much better than I can, but the idea that there's another level whereby what it could mean is it's incredibly symbolic or emblematic of the second coming, and that the Samaritan is the good shepherd and the Samaritan represents Christ. So there's a whole symbolic meaning above the manifest meaning, which in its turn is hidden by the fact it's told as a story, as a parable. So there's layers of insulated meaning that you can uncover.
Yeah, and your Jewish or your Hebrew reading friend will be able to explain this better than I can. But every letter of the Hebrew alphabet has a numerical value and a symbolic meaning. And so when you put together, for instance, the Hebrew word for man, which is Adam or Adam, as you know, the English version, the number you get, the numerical value, when you add up all the numerical values of the components, you get like the number of chromosomes a man has or something like that. And you see a lot. That's just one example. As a non-Hebrew reader, the Bible's full of that stuff, you know, hidden symbolic meanings, latent meanings that it takes a lot of, you know, digging into to kind of grasp. And also you can't forget the Christianization of the Hebrew Bible, in the sense that I think Christians read the Hebrew Bible as almost prophecy of what is to come, in the sense of Jesus Christ. So, you know, Christians will often say that Christ is the new Adam and the new Moses, you know, and the new Abraham, and so on and so forth. So I don't want to understate how different readings can inform the theological ideas. You know, there isn't just necessarily one meaning.
Yeah, but again, I think that's there's a guy I mentioned to you off camera, but for watchers and listeners, there's a guy called Frank Kermode, Kermode, who wrote a stunning, relatively short book. But that's not much consolation, because when I say it's relatively short, I've had migraines reading it in a good way, because it's just so dense in a good way. It's incredibly evocative. And he's a literary critic, but he had an active interest in theology. And the book's called The Genesis of Secrecy. And it's about, he concentrates mostly from memory on the Gospel of St. Mark and how it contains parables that actually, and the way in which, maybe you want to talk more about it, Joshua, but the way in which the Gospel of St. Mark is structured in quite a strange way. It's full of mystery. But one of the interesting aspects of, as he unpacks all this, he'll say, for example, your point that Christianity rereads the Old Testament as prefiguring what was to come. But that's also true of any human life. I look back now at the things I did as a youngster and see the effects they've had in my later life. And again, there's no one true interpretation, because I'll have forgotten significant contributory factors. I'll remember the things it's convenient for me to remember. But this idea that, what you're saying is there might be a hint for some people that the Christianity's misread the Old Testament, and that's a bad thing. Whereas I think what Commode is saying is it's a natural thing. As society and culture evolves, you bring your own new interests to the text.
Well, I don't think it's, sorry, go ahead.
No, go on, finish you up.
I was just going to say, I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing. It's just another way to read it.
Yeah. Except what I'm suggesting is you might get a religious Orthodox Jew who says that's not how you should read the Torah. I think Mark Commode is a really bad film critic. Frank Commode's response would be, you've missed the point. There are institutional control, so different religions will take a text and exert control over it, and different individuals. So there's an institutional response, there's an individual response, but as life changes, as the conditions of life change, you cannot but bring different things to an original text. And maybe the Old Testament's a bad example, because for some Orthodox Jews, their consistency to the text has remained steadfast. And in a certain sense, some Orthodox Jews, the way they obey the Sabbath, the way their lifestyle, in some ways hasn't changed for a couple of thousand years. Whereas I think maybe from a Christian background, we're so much more used to changing with the flows and seeing new things in the text, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, that's what the Reformation was all about. It was all about going back to the scripture, sola scriptura, and moving away from tradition. And it was, I think the inflections do change over time, right? And you pointed this out. But one of the things is that I think Christians take Jesus Christ's Jewishness and use that as one of the ways to appropriate the Hebrew scriptures. So that's another way of making sense of it from a Christian perspective, is using the Jewishness of Jesus and the Jewishness of Paul and the disciples and so on, and saying that this text is actually a Christian text. So I think you're absolutely right in that sense. Yeah.
I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, because again, I want to develop this theme that actually the Bible is so much more interesting than people realize.
Yeah.
So there's a Jewish writer, Mark Glauberman, who I think's published 3 books, and in one of them, I think it's called The Raven and the Dove, and he mentions that when Noah releases the dove, he says that no one ever asked what happened to the raven. And a lot of people don't even know a raven was released at the same time.
Yeah.
So correct me if I'm wrong. The story is he releases the raven never comes back.
Right.
He releases the dove, and the dove comes back, and then without anything, and then comes back again with a piece of foliage in its mouth.
Yeah.
To show that land is near.
Yeah.
But what would your answer be to what happened to the raven?
Well, I think that's a symbolic and allegorical, picture there of light and dark, and I think taking that to be literal. I mean, that whole story is also drawing from the Gilgamesh epic as well, or arguably so. I'm not saying that it definitely is, but these stories are feeding off of each other. So I'm not comfortable saying that there is a literal reading of that. As much as I'm not
saying either. Well, Glauberman, forgive me because it's a while since I read it, but Glauberman's interpretation backs up what you were saying about Genesis 1 and 2.
Yeah.
His argument is that Genesis 1, so to speak, is the cosmological. This is how the universe was structured.
Yeah.
Genesis 2, in Glauberman's interpretation, is that it's about the particularity of humankind.
Right.
So all the species were made and God saw that it was good. But it's the human beings have dominion, and that's been misinterpreted in various ways. But Glauberman's arguing we have dominion because we are particular. We are individual creatures made in the image of God, as it's put.
Yeah.
Whereas animals are just parts of species. They live, they
Sure.
die, the species continues.
Sure,
But what's
sure.
truly unique about human beings is we are individuals.
Sure, sure.
And that's what Genesis 2 is all about. And in that context, the dove is related to civilization. The raven is a wild animal, so it doesn't matter if it comes back or not.
Well, also there's the link to the baptism of Jesus by John the Baptist, and a dove sort of appears and lands on Jesus, which denotes the Holy Spirit. So I'm sure that text is drawing from the dove imagery in the Old Testament also. So there is clearly a sort of spiritual significance of the dove returning as opposed to the raven. What that specifically means, I don't know.
But without getting you to fixate on what it may or may not mean, don't you find it interesting that the vast majority of people have never thought of the raven?
Yeah, no, I mean, I hadn't given much thought to the raven myself. Yeah.
Well, then the other, I think I've heard you mention it. There's the idea that God attacked Moses. Doesn't he beat Moses up and almost kill him at one point?
Oh, I think you may be thinking of Israel. God wrestling with Israel. Is that what you're
No,
talking about?
wasn't that Jacob wrestling with the angel.
Yeah, Jacob. He wrestles with the angel or the image of God, and then he's renamed and he's given the name Israel because Israel means we who wrestle with God.
Yeah. That's one story, but isn't there a point? I'm sure Harold Bloom mentions it, but there's a point at which God, is it in Exodus? God basically tries to murder Moses at one point. Yahweh
he tries to murder
I need
Moses.
to look this up. Sorry, it's again discussing
Yeah.
something with a senile person. But again, the vast majority, and I think that he was talking about how there was a particular preacher gave a talk in which he referenced God trying to kill Moses, and very learned biblical scholars said to him, "Where's this?" And he said, "It's in the Bible, but people have there's like a collective forgetting."
Oh, interesting. I mean, nothing's coming to mind at the moment except for when he's given the commandments, and he obviously God appears on Mount Sinai, and Moses cannot see him, because God can't be seen, and you can't look at God and still live, basically.
I'll look it up.
No,
we'll talk about it in future because I'll look it up. I'm paranoid about having just made it up in my febrile imagination.
Well, there is the story of Abraham being commanded to kill his son, sacrifice his son.
Is that called the Akedah, or in Hebrew the Akedah? I think it is.
Yeah, I'm not going to venture to pronounce it, but yeah, is that what you mean, or are you?
No, it's a completely separate. I'm pretty sure, I might be wrong. I might be completely wrong, but I thought it was Moses, and I thought God basically beats him up within an inch of his life. In this, it's Yahweh, so it's the J writer, and it's one of the examples of how punitive and irascible God in the Yahweh form is, which makes him a fascinating literary character.
You'll have to send that to me because I haven't read it in that way. If it's there.
And the other, I'm just thinking out loud because of all the things. So one, I was reading the Commode book today, and he was talking about how one theory is that the Gospel of Saint Mark should finish. Is it chapter 13? And it's something like the last 8 or so chapters have been added on because it should end with they go into the empty tomb and Jesus isn't there and the women were afraid.
Yeah.
And he says there is one theory that St. Mark's Gospel should end on the word afraid.
Well, the original ending of the Gospel of Mark is what we call the shorter ending, which is where they are afraid and they say nothing to anybody ever. That's the original ending. And lest we forget, Mark is the first gospel that was written. So it raises questions as to how the other gospel writers came to the conclusions that they came to and ended their gospels the way they did. when Mark was the first gospel. Now, I've spoken to professors about this, and their interpretation is that, well, that's an invitation for the reader to not respond in the same way as the women do in the Gospel of Mark. So I think it's a little far-fetched to say that, but it signifies that there isn't a singular voice, you know, and also these
But sorry to
Gospels
interrupt you, but when I went back and looked at it, I actually think Commode's quoting other theologists. Well, theologists, he's not a theologist himself.
Yeah.
But it does look, and maybe this is just confirmation bias, it does look like the gospel should end at that point.
Yeah.
And it does look like the 8 or so further chapters have been tagged on.
Yeah. And that's what I mean. When I mean those gospels are called the synoptic gospels, meaning they're to be taken together, like different camera angles of the same thing. And these gospels are being conveyed through little stories to around the community. So it's not like they're standardized. They're being told from all these different perspectives. So it does raise the question of interpretation and hermeneutics. But that perspective of this is an invitation to the reader to react differently strikes me as a little bit one-dimensional.
Well, the other thing that Commode, I just thought, I'm obsessed at the moment with Frank Commode's book because I think it's absolutely brilliant. But one of the examples he gives is when Jesus is arrested in Gethsemane, there's a young boy with a linen cloth, and the soldiers try and capture him, and the cloth falls off and he runs away naked.
Yeah.
But that's like, I think it's 2 verses, and it gets complicated. There's a guy called Morton Smith who was a controversial theologist who claimed he'd found a letter, was it in Syria or in some monastery, that said there was an actual alternative version of Mark's gospel where that story was developed further. But it is interesting that in the existing extant version of St. Mark's gospel, there is this 2-verse mention of this boy in the linen cloth, but then there's also in the empty burial chamber, there's a boy in a linen cloth.
Yes, exactly. They're all different. They're almost all different stories. I forget the specifics now, but in Mark, it's a little boy. In Matthew, it's like an angel, and then in Luke, it's yet another different, you know, different characters show up at the very end. So they're all different retellings of the same story, which I think, you know, to respond to the Alex O'Connors and Dawkinses of the world, you know, that the Bible itself doesn't assume one narrative. So I think that's important to remember on the subject of you know, having all the answers in an orderly fashion.
I'm trying to think of other examples that I found. I think the other one was the discussion over why Jesus spoke in parables, and is it hinter? There's 2 words in Greek. One means in order that, and one means because.
Okay.
So the interpretation is, if you use, I'm trying to, I wrote it down somewhere. That's right, hoti and hina. So hina means in order to. So when Jesus says, "Why do I speak in parables?" In order to confuse people.
Yes. Well, that links back to what I said earlier.
Yeah, but the other interpretation is if it's hoti or hoti, Hoti, that just means because. So that interpretation would be, I speak in parables because otherwise the people would be confused.
Yeah.
So there's 2 completely diametrically opposed interpretations depending on the choice of one word or the other.
Yeah, I think that's characteristic of the Bible, because if you look at the book of Proverbs, for instance, there's a particular line that says, a particular verse that says, "Answer a fool in his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes." And immediately the next verse is, "Don't answer a fool in his folly, lest you become a fool yourself." And the Bible's full of these, like, you know, what would appear to be contradictions, immediate contradictions. But I think it all comes back to the parable notion, where if you're sympathetic to it, you will be let in, and if you're not, then you're going to be left out. I think that's the central idea of the faith, to be honest, and the
Well, that,
readings of these texts.
before I forget, that's what made me think of, in a previous video, looked at Kafka Before the Law.
Yeah.
Which is, for those who don't know, is a section, I think it's in the penultimate chapter of the trial, where there's this and Kafka published Before the Law as a separate story, but it's presented as a parable. And again, for people who aren't familiar with it, there's a guy who comes from the countryside. He sits at this, he tries to get through this door, and there's a doorkeeper, and he won't let him through. And it's something like, I've forgotten how it's precisely phrased, but it's not that he doesn't try it on. The doorkeeper just says you can't come in, but he doesn't. The person trying to get in doesn't push it, and sits outside the door. And he sits outside the door, and he can see this radiance from within, but he's not allowed in. And the guy says, "Well, you can come past me, but there are other doorkeepers, and you'll have to get past them." So he sits outside the door for decades. And then just before he dies, the doorkeeper said, "This door was always for you, but you're never going to come through it." And I think he closes it. And the idea, but it's beautiful, but it's what makes me think Kafka is it's hilarious, because he wasn't a practicing Jew. And he obviously didn't believe in God, but he basically seems to describe a world that would exist with a God-shaped hole.
Yeah, I like that analogy.
Yeah, no, it's bizarre, because you read Kafka and it's deeply spiritual and religious.
I think Kafka's theology is very similar to my reading of Christian theology, which is, you know, and this is apparent to me through reading particularly Metamorphosis. And we've already discussed this, but that sense of things just get worse and worse and worse and worse and worse in one's life. And where's the meaning? Well, there isn't one. And I think that's more true of Christianity than not.
Yeah, in Before the Law, the implication is you do get to see sorry, and I only mentioned it because of your point about being allowed inside the parable or not. And I think Before the Law is a little bit of a twist on that. It's saying you can see the radiance of the parable, but even if the parable is designed only for you, even if that door is only for you, you actually still can never truly enter it.
Yeah.
And that's, again, it becomes incredibly elliptical, but the idea is that you can have a hint of meaning. You can see the radiance under the door, but you can never fully access it.
Yeah.
Which is simultaneously, I find, bizarrely life-affirming and depressing in equal measure.
No, I mean, look at the contextual sort of ways that you can reinforce that from a Christian perspective. You look at all the disciples, and they didn't follow Jesus to, you know, some kingdom or their thrones, but rather to their graves, and they died in rather gruesome ways. And, you know, I think sometimes it's interesting to me that that isn't immediately apparent when you study the Bible in Christianity, but it's nonetheless very, very important to know that, because I think that really seasons theology with a sense of reality, and that maybe there isn't an answer. You know, these disciples followed Jesus until the end of his life, and what did they gain from it in their lives? Well, nothing really. They died gruesome and horrible, sometimes even worse deaths than Jesus did.
God, you really are. If there's anyone watching, sorry. We promised you a veil of tears, and Joshua's delivered. Was there anything you wanted to talk about specifically?
I think the Tower of Babel is an interesting story, is it not? Because it reminds me of Derrida and Derrida's conception of language. Because in the Tower of Babel narrative, It's like, society tries to build up to God, and God strikes them down and scatters them into communities that don't speak the same language. And to me, I read that as wholly about linguistics. Like Derrida says, I'm paraphrasing here, but he talks about language dying and resurrecting. So it dies because there's no fixed meaning. It's sort of, the meaning is determined by what it doesn't mean, right? A word is, the meaning of a word is determined by what it doesn't mean. Difference. And when the word is used again, that's when it resurrects. So there's like a death and resurrection because meaning isn't fixed. And I see that in the Tower of Babel narrative, where meaning is not fixed any longer. There was this myth of one sort of holistic and seamless language that people spoke. And then after the Tower of Babel, the events of the Tower of Babel, we are all scattered away into our own sort of disparate and disjointed ways of making meaning and making sense of the world and communicating with others. I think that's metaphorical also.
Well, it's partly literal in the sense that I remember there's a book called Echolalia,
Yeah.
which I believe is a term for babbling,
Yeah.
which obviously is where we get Babel. But in that book, the author was saying that children, before they are able to form speech, no matter where they are in the world, all children are able to pronounce all possible linguistic noises.
Mm.
And it's only when so they babble. It's a universal language of babbling children.
Mm-hmm.
And it's only as you learn a specific language that you actually biologically lose the ability to say certain things, because your tongue and mouth gets trained in a certain way.
Yeah. That's Derrida's difference, in a sense.
But it's what I'm suggesting is that the Tower of Babel story, the underlying meaning about this, there was a universal language, is actually physiologically to some extent true.
Yeah. Well, Lacan says this as
inverted.
well.
The what? Sorry.
Lacan talks about the primordial chaos prior to the entry into the mirror stage, and prior to the entry into the symbolic. There's this sort of primordial chaos that we all inhabit, though it may not be a language. It is a sort of state that once you've left, you can't get back into. Which, that's the Tower of Babel to me.
Well, also, isn't it it's the idea that they were building a city. And again, it's one of those ambiguous, we need to look at it, because from memory, it's only about 18 lines long, isn't it?
It's not that long.
It's an incredibly concise story, but the idea is that God, arguably, people get fixated on the tower and they interpret it as they were trying to go so high that they would challenge God. And I've read loads of interpretations saying, no, that's an over-interpretation, because when we actually look at the text, there isn't much condemnation of the tower. It's almost a throwaway line. They will reach the heavens or something. But what it's been interpreted as meaning is that it was about people coming together in a city and becoming more and more uniform and collated together, when in God's purpose was, he said, go forth and multiply, scatter.
Yeah.
So the idea is that, but it goes back to this issue we spoke about earlier about particularity and generality.
Yeah.
God wants each person to be an individual in their own right.
Right.
And especially, there's a whole thing we could do on the notion of the theology of cities, but cities tend to be the epicenter of sin. And if not sin, there is this collectivity in a city you get. It's why some people like living in cities. It's the anonymity. You're just one of a number.
Yeah.
And some people, in my view, bizarrely prefer that to actually being an individual. And admittedly, and if you live in a village like I do, people see what you do. If you upset someone, as I have a tendency to, they remember it. Because you're not in an anonymous city. But again, that issue of Genesis 1 and 2, the idea of particularity. And you could think of the modern media, to build upon our previous discussion. to some extent being an example of the ethos behind building the Tower of Babel is to bring everyone together. And while I'm rambling, there's a guy, he's a brilliant historian stroke philosopher, Michael Oakeshott, who I refer to quite often. But he has this concept of a civil association, meaning a society built upon a need to be together, tradition, and loosely written laws that are basically common law, versus a society of enterprise. And when he says society of enterprise, he doesn't mean business. He means there are societies of enterprise that have a teleological explicit aim. So they want to build the Tower of Babel. They want to build a city.
Yeah.
When you get to the 1900s, Stalin wants to build the communist dream. Pol Pot, Mao, all these people, they wanted to create societies of enterprise. And I think that's also the Tower of Babel story.
Yeah.
God's in favor of civil association. God's in favor of shepherds. God's in favor of dispersed tribes.
Yeah.
But one of our aspects of our human nature is to congregate.
Yeah.
And it seems to bring the worst out in us.
Well, I think there's also an element that touches on knowledge. So the Tower of Babel, and this is contrasted with the Platonic idea of knowledge, in the sense that knowledge leads up to the heavens in Plato, whereas in the Judeo-Christian tradition, knowledge is the thing that alienates, and it's the thing that causes God to be displeased with humanity. So it's almost like there's a Judeo-Christian response to knowledge in a subversive way that conflicts with the scientific method and other sort of philosophies of thought.
Yeah, and it's again, something that often doesn't get addressed is everyone talks about the tree of knowledge, but people tend to forget the tree of life.
Yeah, exactly. And knowledge is sort of cast in this role of antagonist in the Bible, in general, which, that's fascinating to me.
Well, yes, but is it? What if I do my Zizek? On the other hand, because if you look at I think Alex O'Connor speaks about this, to be fair to him, it's the Satan, my snake here.
Yeah.
Isn't actually, I think the way he's described it's depending on how you interpret the word, it's sly or cunning. But Alex O'Connor points out in Proverbs, the same word is translated as sensible. And so one reading is the snake was the most sensible of the creatures. And the idea is that apparently there's a Gnostic, I think it's called the Testament to Truth. There's a Gnostic story in which the serpent is actually Jesus. But that's a whole other can of worms, so to speak. But interestingly, again, if you go and look at the actual lines in Genesis, the serpent isn't described that badly, I don't think.
Well, also Moses is given a serpent. He holds up. There's two instances. He has the staff that turns into a serpent, and then there's the serpent once they've come out of Egypt. So it's not like there's this arbitrary sort of definition of serpentine evil.
Well, also, what I think I'm pointing towards is the idea that meaning accretes, meaning sediments like a pearl, but ironically, instead of a pearl of wisdom, you get a pearl of misunderstanding.
Yeah.
So it's what Roland Barthes refers to as what goes without saying. Your earlier point about ideology, it's so baked into Western culture to interpret the Genesis story of the snake as the snake represents evil. But I'm arguing that if you actually look at the text, that's actually a bit of a jump. And it's become self-evidently true because of centuries of accretion.
Right.
Which, again, is about the institutional control over the text and habit and custom. Whereas if you read the text with a bit more care, it throws up all these questions again.
Yeah, I think that's one of the keys to understanding, the Bible, is reading the text again because, you know, to touch on your institutional control, in my experience, you know, the evangelical tradition would look at even like wine drinking and say that that's a sin. Where if you looked at the text, nowhere does that come about except for, you know, in the context of excess.
Well, also, given that Jesus changed water into wine, assuming he wanted people to drink the wine.
That's what I mean. Yeah.
Well, how do the evangelicals get around that?
Well, one answer I've heard is that wine is grape juice in this context when it's clearly not.
I know I have a non-standard translation of the Bible. In my Bible, it actually says Guinness.
Now, that's the Bible I'd like to read. Yeah.
Right. Well, I think I've talked myself to a standstill, unless there's anything you wanted to chat about.
No, I just the Tower of Babel thing was the most compelling thing for me because of the association with language and how, you know, we build up to knowledge, but that's in fact our undoing. To me, that's what I've been thinking about recently.
Yeah, and on a broader textual level, that's why I've become increasingly fascinated by this concept of hermeneutics and Hermes, the Greek god, who's incredibly complicated because he's the god of messengers, tricksters, envoys, heralds. There's so much in there. And the idea that hermeneutics, it's par for the course that if you engage in hermeneutics, you will be tricked. It's in the very term itself, hermeneutics.
Right. Exactly.
Which again takes me back to the serpent in the Garden of Eden. I'm a bit more milder on the serpent, in the sense that if hermeneutics is based upon Hermes, I understand that's the Greek mythology rather than Judaism. But there's a similarity. The serpent is presented as a trickster type animal, which is common in lots of different, you know, ancient traditions.
Yeah.
So it would be the coyote, wouldn't it, in North American indigenous Indians?
Right. Yeah.
I've been doing recently, I did a video on rabbits. The rabbit in Native American culture was also a trickster character.
Yeah.
But if, again, the serpent in the Garden of Eden just represents the idea that any engagement with knowledge is likely to leave you being deceived.
Yeah.
Then if that's a part of human fallibility, which then arrives metaphorically because we're forced to leave the Garden of Eden, where everything is provided for us and you don't have to interpret anything. In order to live as independent, particular human beings, you have to sign up for being tricked, going through pain, and all the things that are described in the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. But if that interpretation is valid, then the serpent is a necessary condition for human freedom.
Yeah, absolutely. And therein lies the paradox. You know, knowledge. Sorry, what were you going to say something?
I was going to say it's not so much of a paradox if you don't buy into the demonization of the serpent.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
I'm saying I'm not claiming I'm right, but I'm just saying we're so attuned to seeing the serpent as evil.
Yeah.
Whereas, what if, to do the Zizek thing, what if the serpent actually represents like being expelled from the Garden of Eden? My reading is being expelled from the Garden of Eden wasn't a great tragedy. Because without being expelled, we'd be zombies walking around with permagrins.
Yeah.
And
completely.
that's not what it truly is to be human.
No, exactly.
What it is to be truly human is to drink industrial amounts of Nigerian Guinness and watch football till your eyes bleed.
Yeah, and having the choice to do so, and being criticized by evangelicals because you drank a Guinness as being a heretic or something. That is the meaning of life. You've uncovered the meaning of life, and I think you should teach a class on theology at Emory.
I think maybe what we could agree on to sum up is that what I've got against Richard Dawkins, and not that they're the same, but the Alex O'Connors, and on the flip side, the evangelical fundamentalist branches, are that ultimately, so with Dawkins, it just amazes me. To all intents and purposes, he's a highly belief-driven atheist. So his atheism is to me, looking at it from the outside, as much of a belief as an evangelical Christian hitting you over the head with the Bible.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's one of the things about atheism, is that it's in itself a belief system.
Yeah, he needs God to not exist as much as an evangelical needs God to exist.
To exist, yeah.
They're flip sides of the same coin.
No, exactly. Yeah.
Whereas the answer is to be permanently confused, like us two.
Well, I mean, give me a couple of pints of Guinness and I'll be less confused. I seem to get the answers to things when I've had a couple of pints of Guinness.
Admittedly, you started early, but when we had our session, I think you wimped out earlier than me, didn't you?
I think I did. Yeah, not this next time though.
I'm taking that as a challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I had 15 pints about a week ago. So, see you match that, Dr. Paul Taylor.
In the past, it's with me, it's always been, if there's an event. So, for example, I was at a wedding in America, and it was very, very funny. It was in I think it was New Hampshire.
Okay.
And I was a guest. It was the sister of a girl I was going out with, so I was a part of the wedding party, vaguely. And it was a country estate, and I don't drive, so you got dropped off at a country estate for 2 or 3 days.
Oh God.
But because it was New Hampshire at the time, I'm guessing like late 1990s or something.
Yeah.
They kept a track of everything you drank.
Oh. Okay.
But I kept getting asked, "Are you driving tonight, sir?" And I kept saying to the same bartender, "I do not have a license. I am British. It is my right to drink." But because there was dancing involved, and because there was a wedding, and because it was quite a long period of time, I think the final tally was 21 bottles of Beck's.
Oh Christ!
I had the little marks of crossed off to make 5.
21.
But it was American strength. What, 4 or 5%? It's not.
Yeah, 4%.
They were relatively small bottles. But my point there is, it's back to the notion of meaning. If there's a meaning to the activity, I don't notice the level. I couldn't do that within a million years if you just sat there watching the telly.
Right.
Because
Yeah.
you're not distracted enough. There has to be the meaning. I'm trying to desperately grab this back to having biblical meaning.
Well, alcohol is inherently biblical, so I mean, no issues there.
Yeah, it's like what you call it. Jesus turned a 6-pack of Becks into however many.
I mean, he made the finest wine, according to the story in the Gospel of John. He made the best wine when they'd run out of, like, they'd finished the wine and he made more.
I was there. Why did you save the best wine till last? Because the tradition is you give the best wine first. That was the line, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. It's a subversion.
Yeah.
Complete subversion.
On that subversive note, what I propose is, if you're up for it, in a month's time approximately, we should maybe look in specifics at the Gospel of St. Mark.
Okay. Yeah.
Because that wouldn't involve any work for you, would it, really?
No, not too much.
What do you feel about, like, using some slides? Because
sure, yeah, like turn it into a lecture sort of thing.
Yeah, and I'll heckle. But that would, because I can make you there's some lingo, like you're a team leader or something on this, so you could have control of the presentation.
Okay.
If you need me to get the slides to come up, be prepared for chaos.
Well, I feel like got to be prepared for chaos anytime you're about. So
what I'll probably do is I'll look into making you. It's like getting promoted at McDonald's. I'll make you a team leader on this channel.
Okay.
And you'll get your little badge. And then you can
do you wear a poppy?
I would if I ever left the house.
Okay.
But I only leave the house these days to walk the dogs, and no one's going to see me.
Oh, I see. I wore a poppy because I was just at home. I bought a poppy, and I pinned it on my sweater that I ended up wearing out to Emory, and I got so much crap for it.
Really?
Yeah.
I went all Scouse then with a very high voice.
Really? I don't care about your poppy.
On what basis that their right to make fun of you was bought by the blood of American and British soldiers?
Well, I was supporting the military, so apparently I was supporting the military, and so that was morally reprehensible or something.
It wasn't a disagreement. It was just a bizarre exchange. I had a very good, bright American academic colleague.
Yeah.
Whose work on philosophy I admire immensely. And we got into a discussion in the pub about the weird, and I don't want to make it Democrat Republican because I'm not invested in either side in America, but the thing about the way in which in certain cities that tend to be Democrat defund the police movements have arisen.
Yeah.
And I don't really understand that, because I said to him, isn't the protection of the weak and vulnerable in a society
Yeah.
the most basic responsibility any government has?
Yeah.
And he seemed to sidetrack that by saying it's a bit paternalistic to think that people need protecting.
Yeah.
And it goes back to your point about someone's giving you grief about wearing the poppy. I did a video on toxic masculinity and why periodically you need it.
Yes. Well, I mean, toxic femininity is a thing too.
But except toxic masculinity, when push comes to shove, and I think there's biblical relevance to this. It would be interesting your perspective on, was Jesus a pacifist? Because as I pointed out earlier, the turn the other cheek has different connotations. He also said eye for an eye, didn't he? He requoted the Old Testament.
Jesus was pretty radical. I wouldn't describe him as being a pacifist. No, he would take what was said to him and turn it on its head and throw it back.
Yeah, so if someone criticizes you for wearing a poppy, I think he'd have a rejoinder.
Yeah. Well, you'll be happy to know that I didn't take my poppy off. I kept it on.
So he could have said something like, he who has not relied upon the military to protect their basic freedoms, throw the first jibe.
Exactly. Yeah. If you'd have been there to quote Jesus in that way, through some personal experiential revelation that he may or may not have said to you, and said it out loud to me, I would have taken it on board and hit whoever it was that said that to me.
It would be interesting if I lived, because I've always dreamed about living on a Texan compound with a pile of dogs and lots of shotguns and, David Koresh-like. And that dream may still come true.
I don't know if you heard, but there was some gunshots that were fired just a few minutes ago. Did you hear them?
No.
Yeah, just
is that people hunting?
I don't know. I live on like 10 acres of prime Georgia land surrounded by other plots. So they just do whatever they want.
They'll be hunting.
Probably. Maybe not.
Something for the pot.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know why someone from New Jersey is living in Georgia.
Is this still recording?
Yes.
Okay.
That's why I tried to bring it back to religion and Jesus. Because wittering on.
Okay, bring it back to religion then.
Well, I just did, so I think we should just end before you realize it's like one of your senior moments, isn't it? What's for dinner?
I'm 30 now, so.
Are we still filming?
You're the one who showed up an hour early.
Well, that's because how keen I was.
And gave me shit for it.
Well, I think things are quickly degenerating into non-biblical territory, so I
don't
propose...
know about that. We're fellowshipping, that's biblical.
Right, we're fellowshipping. I'm bearing testament.
Exactly.
To your, what you call it, alcoholic incontinence. Right. Right, we're going now. So in a month's time, we'll look at the Gospel of St. Mark.
Okay.
Sure. And I look forward to that. So this time, we're ending the stream, everybody. Thanks very much. Hope you enjoyed it. Till the next time. All the best.
Thank you. God bless.